Being a solo indie dev, time and budget are always at a minimum. Because of this, I have to get creative with what I have to get the most out of it. That applies to all aspects of this project. As I continue to write the story and further define gameplay ideas, I often have to remind myself that less is more. What I mean by this in regard to Advent Act is that I believe creating a smaller experience of a higher quality will have a greater impact than a larger project of lower quality. A great example that uses this design philosophy is the PlayStation classic Shadow of the Colossus. That brings us to where we are today, where I want to add more depth to the combat experience. This idea has been lingering on my mind since I played an enjoyable anime action game back in 2024. That game was Grand Blue Fantasy Relink. I could spend this whole video gushing about how this game looks, but that's not why I'm bringing it up. The game features many playable characters, with one such character being the swordsman Siegfried. His gameplay caught my attention because of one simple mechanic. Basically, the player can mash the attack button and the character will perform a combo of melee attacks as normal, the same as any other character. But, if the player times the input of their attack to be within a specified window conveyed by a special UI indicator on the screen, then the damage dealt by the resulting attack will be greater than the normal amount. This simple mechanic adds an extra level of skill to the combat while also providing a rewarding feeling to the player when they time their attack perfectly, dealing the max amount of damage to the enemy. Now, before I continue, I want to address something so the same comments as usual don't get left on the video. You see, anytime I show the source of inspiration for a gameplay element or aesthetic choice, I always have at least one person who leaves a comment pointing out that my implementation is not the exact same as what I showed in the inspiration. I am not trying to recreate my inspirations one for one. I am simply inspired by them to create my own implementation that is similar but unique. Okay, let's continue. Before we can proceed with the development of this mechanic, we first need to develop some UI to convey the impact of the action. The UI, or user interface of a game, is something I have strong feelings about. Bad UI to me isn't something that breaks my immersion, but instead is something that lessens the art direction of the game. The city of Final Fantasy is a famous example of a user interface that goes to the extreme with the amount of information being conveyed at any given time. Rocksteady's Suicide Squad also received a lot of flack on release for its UI, with numbers and indicators often flooding the screen in moments of combat. These are pitfalls I want to avoid, but I recognise that some visual feedback is necessary to relay feedback to the player that what they did had an impact. This is further true in a game like mine with a retro aesthetic. The low resolution makes it more difficult to convey impact through animation alone. That's why I've chosen to show damage numbers on impact. It won't be egregious though, I promise. How to do this wasn't clear to me initially. I first thought about using a particle system to spawn the UI elements, but the more I thought about it, the more I realised I would have to do a fair amount of wrestling with the predefined system to make it do what I want. I decided that creating my own system would be more efficient. I then thought about having the numbers be a screen space UI element, controlling the position and scale of the element through code. This would be kind of a backwards way of doing it though, as instead of trying to emulate the UI existing in the world, I could actually have it exist by making the UI world space. I made the effects spawn at the midpoint of the enemy. I also made it so the effect always appears in front of all the models in the game. I did this by setting the effects prefab to exist on its own layer. I then untagged that layer in the culling mask of my main camera, so the objects on that layer weren't rendered. Then, I created a second camera that only renders this effect. Lastly, I set my new camera to be an overlay view of my main camera, and there we have it. The positioning and scale of the element is quite simple, so I won't go too deep into it, but basically, the object's position is set to track the midpoint of the enemy, and the scale is determined by the distance of the camera to the object, increasing in scale the further the camera is and decreasing as it gets closer. To finish the effect, I made the UI float up once it was spawned. Of course, the instantiation of these objects is handled by my object pooler I created in my last devlog. Now on to the combat. Currently, how my combat works is that the player must enter their next attack input during a certain window of the current playing attack animation to cue the next attack in the combo. This is similar to how most Souls-like work. For example, if I mash the light attack button twice, a 2-string combo won't be played. I need to time the input of my second attack to be within a specified window of my first attack. For the mechanic I'm implementing now, I needed to change this. Instead, the player can now enter the input of their next attack during any point while the current attack animation is being played out. To trigger the maximum damage effect though, the input must be entered during a short window of the animation. I made the sword glow yellow when the window is open to let the player know when to time their input. The damage multiplier for a correctly timed input is set to 1.5, meaning that, for example, if the base damage was 100, the attack will now deal 150 points of damage. As an extra bit of visual feedback to let the player know that they performed the time attack correctly, I made the damage UI change colour from its standard white to yellow. Already this simple change made the combat feel much more engaging, adding a metagame with the player trying to time their inputs perfectly for maximum damage. I was pretty happy with how this turned out. I look forward to the day when others can get a chance to experience what I created and give me feedback on their experience. My current goal is to create a vertical slice, showcasing all the core mechanics, giving a taste of what the final product will look and feel like. I will make this demo available publicly so anyone interested can give it a try and let me know what they think. I would like to complete this by the end of the year, but don't hold me to that. I recognise that life happens, so I don't want to hold myself to any strict deadlines. To polish the effect, I changed the UI from spawning at the midpoint of the enemy to spawning at a random point within a sphere located at the same midpoint. This made the effect feel a little more organic. I changed the colour of the time damage input of the UI to be closer to that of the colour of the blade when it glows. That's it for now. In the next devlog, I'll be developing something new but also familiar. If you'd like to follow along with the development of this project, then please consider subscribing. If this is the first video of mine you've watched, then I recommend watching some of my previous devlogs. There's a playlist on my channel page. Until next time.